Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. It's been a long time. Um, my longtime hardcore fans know that I've been listening to the Harry Potter audiobooks with my son over the last few months, really. And I've been trying to take lessons from them. We can learn about writing, and there's a lot of really interesting things to say about the Harry Potter books that we can learn about writing for sure. Especially if you take book one as essentially J.K. Rowling's taking a long time to learn on the job and all the ways she develops from book one to book two to book three, I think the original series arguably peaks with book five and sort of settles into a routine for book six and seven. Arguably, of course. For me, the best three are three, four, and five. That is my opinion, of course. But one of the highlights of book five is the evils of Umbridge, and a lot of people identify her as the scariest villain in the whole series. And that is a really interesting thing to identify, and I think part of that comes from, especially in direct comparisons of Umbridge to Voldemort. Part of that comes from some of the mistakes, arguably some of the mistakes in book two. And I've talked about the mistakes in book two. What I would say are mistakes in book two. The learning on the job sort of, I would say, book two is where J.K. Rowling really, really learned how to write a Harry Potter book by making lots of mistakes. That's my argument, at least. But Umbridge, she's often interpreted as the evilest villain, and a common interpretation of why that's true is because people will say Voldemort is just a fantasy villain, and Umbridge is scarier because she's real. And I've spoken many times about my problems with overuse of the word real as a value judgment. It's calling something good because it's realistic, I think, is a grossly overused concept. If you look at the rainbow circle, I don't have the rainbow circle with me. It's a nice, beautiful December day. Nice temperature. I'm in short sleeves. It's nice and warm, actually. But if you look at the rainbow circle, reality is really the fourth level. The core level of the rainbow circle is emotional impact. And if you go, no, it's the fifth level. I keep getting that wrong. There are only 7 levels, and reality is the 5th level away from the core. But a lot of people will point to that and say, what really makes something emotionally impactful is the reality of it, which is a misconception, I think. So what you're really looking at with Umbridge versus Voldemort is the emotional impact. How does, and arguably, I mean, it's entirely subjective, but arguably, Umbridge does have a significantly greater degree of emotional impact than Voldemort. And that's really worth exploring why. Not necessarily that she's more realistic. She's more like an actual evil person you'd meet in real life. That's really a marginal element of it, arguably. But why is she scarier? And I think a big part of it you can identify in the sequencing of the novels. I would argue Order of the Phoenix is where J.K. Rowling really peaks at her ability to write a Harry Potter book. Excuse me, Harry Potter book. But what you really need to do, I mean, it's a theme and variation structure. Each of the books is structured around a school year. So each of the books has some of the same basic elements, and it's a perfectly valid sort of structure to choose. I mean, a lot of people will universalize formulaic structure as always being bad. Well, that's not really true, and I think that's a big problem with our understanding of how stories work, is saying formula is always bad, originality is always good, which is an impractical and ineffective way to even think about storytelling. Because plenty of great stories will have a formula, but it adds something new each time, so that it gives you the sense of a proper mix, whatever mix works, of familiarity and novelty. So it gives you something you're familiar with, and it gives you something new. If everything was absolutely brand new, it would be an entirely different emotional experience. But the familiarity of the formula is a tempering mechanism, and tempering mechanisms, I would say, are vitally important to storytelling. If everything is emotionally intense all the time, if everything is completely brand new, that'll short circuit the audience's ability to appreciate it. Each Harry Potter book is familiar based on the formula of the previous Harry Potter books, and that gives you a sense of comfort. A lot of the response that people have to the Harry Potter books is that they're very, very comforting, which they are to a degree. And part of that is in that they do follow the very, very same sort of formula each time. But I think part of the problem with book 2 is it followed a lot of book 1, so the theme was still there, but the variation was a bit awkward, didn't quite work, arguably. And I think part 3 was the experimental one because it did shift up the structure in a lot of ways. Voldemort was the villain in book 1 and book 2. The Dementors and Wormtail, you had a couple of different villains, so it gave, and you had more original sort of characters. You had very familiar mythological characters, but book 3 you had original characters who were somewhat familiar. Like the Dementors are original in many, many ways. I mean, they're my personal favorite villains. If you want to rank the villains, I put Dementors at number 1. But they had Dementors who have some familiar qualities to them, but in many ways, the way J.K. Rowling is presenting them is new. And you had like Buckbeak the Hippogriff. I mean, you've seen griffins plenty of times. How many times have you seen a hippogriff? Stuff like that. Whereas in book 4, you had the blast-ended Scroots. And who really loves the blast-ended Scroots? Much more of an original sort of creation, but maybe too original, not familiar enough. I don't know. So, you have that sort of playing around with theme and variation from book to book. And book 4 arguably loads too much in. I love book 4, but it loads too much in. It's still a great story, but it's got so many plots. We just ended that one not that long ago, and the ending just went on and on and on and on because it just had so many plots. Like Ludo Bagman, I forgot about Ludo Bagman completely. The movie cuts him out, which is, did we really lose all that much? But it just goes on and on with resolving all these plots. Book 4 is a lot closer to an Agatha Christie novel. There's an academic paper there, the influence of, or the comparison between Agatha Christie novels and Harry Potter novels. They're much more similar to Agatha Christie novels than they are to most fantasy, arguably. That's a subject for another day. But book 4 is the most Agatha Christie-like because it sets up, who is the murderer, who is the villain, or whatever. What is the plot? And it sets up a dozen possibilities. It gives you all these different red herrings. But then she has to resolve all of them. I mean, Agatha Christie's an expert at this, where she'll have 10 suspects and she'll expertly plot it so that she resolves all of the plots, all of the red herring plots. But anyway, that's another topic. But in book 4, you have Barty Crouch, who has so many different layers to the character that I don't know that he ever really hit as a villain. He's an interesting character, but, it might have been overly complicated to really hit as a villain, whereas Umbridge is very, very simple. I'm not universalizing that. I think that's a problem a lot of people have, is they'll say, Umbridge is more realistic, and that's what makes her scarier. And she's simple, therefore simple villains are scarier. I'm not universalizing that. I'm just saying, just for me personally, Barty Crouch as a villain is an interesting, almost good villain. Just entirely subjectively, an interesting, almost good villain. But me personally, I think there might have been just too many different things going on with Barty Crouch to really hit home as a really compelling villain. Barty Crouch Jr. But then you have Umbridge, and I think what really hits home with Umbridge is not that level 5 idea of representing reality. That's a factor. I mean, certainly I wouldn't dismiss that completely as a factor. The rainbow circle is a spectrum. It's all of these things working together, and reality is part of what works with that. But I would say it's the level 2, that paradox. It goes back to bathos. So I talked a couple times about how much I love bathos, but bathos is really effective because it's that really stark shift in tone. So you go from Voldemort in various forms, just a very traditionally sort of evil character who just kills people. Why does he kill people? Well, he's a Nazi. I mean, there's nothing really all that sympathetic about him as a villain. There's not a whole lot of texture to him as a villain. He's just evil, evil for the sake of evil, presumably. I mean, for much of the first few books. And then you get the Dementors, who are just pure embodiments of terror and evil and, awfulness and what have you. Then you have Barty Crouch, who has a lot of potential. But why does he follow Voldemort? Why does Wormtail follow Voldemort? Well, he was picked on by his friends, I mean, there's potential for some complexity there. But then you have Umbridge. You have all of these really overtly evil characters. Then you have Umbridge, who superficially seems like, a powerless, nice lady. Just entirely superficially. She seems like well put together, and, she seems like some mundane person you might meet in everyday life. I mean, I think that's where the reality comes in there, more as a mechanism of the effect of contrast. But then she turns out to be really, really cruel and horrible and all these different things. And what's her motivation? Her motivation is to keep order. So you have this really drastic shift in tone. You have more of a potent paradox with Umbridge than you do with Voldemort. And I think that's the missed opportunity of Book 2. With Voldemort in Book 2, you had Tom Riddle's diary and all that sort of stuff. And Rowling was trying to set up this mystery of where did this diary come from and all that kind of stuff. And who was Tom Riddle and who opened the Chamber of Secrets and what have you. And we don't get a lot of texture with Tom Riddle. I mean, we have hints here and there. Just in those first few books. I don't really remember Half-Blood Prince style that well. I remember it was really bland, and I sort of just forgot a lot of it, except for the ending. So I know it revealed some stuff about Voldemort. I just can't remember off the top of my head. But in Book 2, we had the possibility of having a really interesting textured... I mean, it sort of hinted at something that could work really well to give Voldemort a bit more complexity up front, in that he was similar to Harry in some ways, but it doesn't quite land as making him a really textured sort of a villain. Usually Voldemort just comes off as just an evil wizard Nazi. And that's about it. So if you compare, the lack of paradox with Voldemort, in the sense that he's just evil and scary, but there's nothing else really tempering that. There's where the tempering mechanism comes in. There's nothing else really tempering that to give him any sort of complexity. He's just evil all the time. And you compare that to Umbridge, who has a lot more texture, who has that really central paradox of trying to come off as really meek and trying to come off as really kind, but ultimately being really, really cruel. You have much more texture to that. And so, I think that's how Umbridge really lands as a scarier villain than Voldemort does. Because conceivably she could convince you that she's doing good. I mean, she's working for the Ministry. I mean, she's working for an organization that could presumably be a good organization. It's not really functioning that way in Order of the Phoenix. But it comes off as someone who may have good intentions, she's evil in many ways, but she may have good intentions. So you sort of have a more complex sort of relationship with, a more complex sort of response to her up front than with Voldemort. And Voldemort is presented just really early on as evil. Voldemort is this purely evil guy who killed Harry's parents and killed all these people. So you don't really have the same sort of complex relationship with him. And I think that's a lot of that is down to lost potential from book 2. A lot of that is down to things that she could have given him more texture. I mean, Voldemort's a fine villain. I mean, he's effective in he's a fine villain in the MCU sort of a way, where he's effective in bringing out the heroism of Harry more so than he is in really making a compelling character for himself, with the exception of Loki. Here's the whole other topic. I like all the villains in the MCU, and I think they work for what they do, and I think Voldemort works fine for what he does. But what really makes Umbridge scarier, and I think what makes Umbridge scarier is not realism, which I think is ultimately minor element in the dynamic, but what makes her scary, I think, is the paradox, the dynamics of good and evil playing out in her, whereas Voldemort is just much more purely evil, so short circuits your ability to feel other things for him, really. But anyway, I think that's all for today. I will. Oh, I was going to relate these to my Opal Bean War. I think probably the story. I'm trying to relate all of my episodes to all of the Opal Bean War stories, and I have 31 of them, which is tricky. But I think this one probably relates better to Mother's Little Helper, which I've talked about before. But with Mother's Little Helper, you have two villains in that one. One of them is, well, Mother's Little Helper, just as a reminder, my long-term fans, of course, my hardcore fans, of course, know everything about that. But Mother's Little Helper is about an abused housewife who has this genie. And so she has the opportunity every day to wish for her husband to die or to just forget everything. And she just keeps wishing to forget everything. And so there's a shift in the story where the genie sort of turns dark, of course. And so the genie is sort of like Voldemort, where, it's a less realistic sort of an evil, whereas the abusive husband is a more realistic sort of an evil. So the danger there, if I just said realistically, if my standard for creating a really scary villain was to make the husband as realistic as possible, and this is based on, flip the genders, of course, but this is based on my own experience, but make the husband as evil as possible, but as realistic as possible. If realism was my only standard, he might end up just really flat, just because, like a real evil, abusive husband can be really flat, and just scary because he's doing the realistic things. That doesn't really give him all kinds of dynamics. Whereas if I prioritize the paradox and those dynamics of emotional response, I would give him some sympathetic motivations. I haven't had the husband in the story much yet, but I would give him sympathetic motivations, not to justify spousal abuse. I would never ever do that, of course. Having experienced it, having been the recipient. But I would, in order to give the emotional response more texture, who is he and why is he committing these horrible acts? If you have just even a little bit of a sympathetic response that tempers the rejection of him, if he's just purely evil, it's not going to have as much emotional texture to it. So it just might short circuit your ability to feel something about him, even if it's hate. If you're just purely hating him, that short circuits your ability to emotionally respond to him and flattens out your response. Whereas if you had just a little skosh, even just a little bit, gives you a lot of texture and emotional response. Whereas the genie is not really a realistic thing. How do I make the genie has fluid gender. How do I make, ultimately, the genie will be a she, but how do I make the genie scary? I'm not really looking at the realism of the genie. That's really an irrelevant factor. What I'm looking at is the genie wouldn't be functioning. The genie basically becomes dangerous because she is embodying all of the suppressed hate and anger that the abused wife is feeling. And so she has this sort of intense emotional attachment to the family, and that's what ends up making her dangerous. So that sort of much more emotionally textured sort of response. She's not evil, she's just intense, and ultimately that manifests as dangerousness. That sort of emotional response has more texture to it, has, ideally, I haven't quite gotten to that part of the story, so I don't know if it's going to turn out well, but that's the goal, is ideally has more of an emotional impact than if the genie was just, Voldemort style, pure evil, magic Nazi sort of a villain. But anyway, that's all for today. Or maybe I'll do one later today, but that's all for right now. See you on the next episode.